Okay, this video introduces stockholder voting. We've already encountered some features of it, but we're going to walk through the basics here. Corporate votes, we've said before, are allocated by default on a one share, one vote basis. Every corporation can have a more complicated voting regime if it wishes to, and that voting regime will be set forth in the Certificate of Incorporation. We've mentioned Facebook before. Here's Facebook's Certificate of Incorporation. It has two classes of stock, Class A and Class B. The certificate says that with respect to dividends, the two classes are treated equally, but that's not so with voting in Section 3.2. It says, except as otherwise expressly provided herein, each holder of Class A common stock will have the right to one vote per share, and each holder of Class B common stock will have the right to 10 votes per share. Mark Zuckerberg, a founder and the CEO of the company, holds 80% of the Class B shares, and thanks to that, he's able to control 53% of the voting power at Facebook. Stockholders transact business in normal times at an annual meeting. At the annual meeting, stockholders will elect directors and also transact any other business. It'll all be done by vote. Up until very recently, you had to hold a physical meeting, but now in Delaware and elsewhere, you can hold a virtual meeting. Obviously, in the COVID era, that's the way things are going. If the board doesn't hold an annual stockholder meeting after a certain amount of time, a stockholder can petition a court to force the corporation to hold a stockholder meeting. Meetings can be called for other purposes. These are called special meetings. This would be a vote on a merger agreement or a sale of all assets, for example. In Delaware, the board can call one, and anyone else who's authorized by the certificate of the bylaws. The RMBCA, which is adopted by Connecticut, allows someone also who holds 10% or more of the voting control to call a special meeting. In corporate voting, in order to be eligible to vote at the meeting, you have to have held the stock at some prior date, called the record date. Each state, Delaware included, allows the board to fix a date to determine which stockholders are entitled to vote. And that date, the date of record, precedes the vote. The record date can be a problem for some people. Carl Icahn, a well-known corporate raider, acquired shares of a company where he intended to vote against an impending merger, but bought the shares too late. They were bought after the record date. In addition to transacting business at a stockholder meeting, stockholders can also act by written consent. In Delaware, stockholders, unless the charter says otherwise, are entitled to act by written consent. The RMBCA, in theory, permits it, but says that all stockholders have to agree, which in practice is impossible. Let's talk about electing and removing directors. So we'll walk through this with a series of questions. Our first is, how often do you elect directors? The answer in Delaware law is annually under 211B. The annual meeting really means 13 months. A corporation has 13 months to hold it. The RMBCA, including Connecticut, it gives you 15 months, but the general range is somewhere between 390 and 500 days. Pennsylvania and Nevada are the highest in the US at 540 days. Other countries have director elections far less frequently. In Germany, it's every 4 years, France every 6 years. Another question is, who votes for directors? We talked about the record date, determining which stockholders vote. And it is almost exclusively the case that it's stockholders who vote for directors. Statutes don't require that directors be elected exclusively by shareholders, but that's normally how it happens. I'm aware of only one US company that allows a non-stockholder group, as a matter of course, to select its directors. That's United Airlines. Here's a snapshot from the proxy statement of United Airlines. United Airlines has a class of preferred stock held by its pilots union. And the pilots union, not stockholders, are entitled to select somebody to serve on the board. Otherwise, besides this example at United Airlines, it's stockholders. So how do you vote for directors? But what I mean by that is, what is the voting system? And we'll walk through two alternatives. One is what we'll call straight voting, and the other is cumulative voting. Straight voting means you get one vote for each seat on the board. And for each seat, the highest vote getter is the winner. Cumulative voting, as we'll see, is something more complicated. So here, let's go through an example of a stockholder election, director election with straight voting. Imagine the corporation has 100 shares. Each share gets one vote. There are two stockholders, A and B. A holds 60 shares, B holds 40 shares, and there are 5 board seats. Stockholder A wishes the candidates in blue here, R to V, to be elected. Stockholder B wishes candidates W to Z. So if the voting is straight, then stockholder A will cast votes in favor of all of the candidates stockholder A likes. That's R to V. So there'll be 60 votes for each of them. Stockholder B will cast affirmative votes for candidates W to Z. The top 5 vote getters are elected to the board. So you can see the board will be composed of candidates R, S, T, U, and V, all the people favored by A. Here's how things are different with cumulative voting. Again, some things are the same. 100 shares, 1 vote per share. A has 60 shares, B has 40 shares. They have the same candidates that they prefer. There are 5 board seats. With cumulative voting, the stockholder is entitled to, in a sense, pile all the votes onto one particular candidate or 2 particular candidates. So if there are 5 board seats, you get 5 votes per share. So A has 60 shares and gets 5 votes per share. So A has in total 300 votes to allocate however A likes. A could vote all 300 for one candidate, R, for example. B has 40 shares, 5 votes per share. And so as a result has 200 votes. Again, those could all be for one candidate, or they could be spread. The top 5 vote getters are elected. So B has a strategy that can ensure that one of B's preferred candidates is elected to the board. B knows that he has, in a sense, 40% of the votes. So if B gives all of B's votes to 2 of B's preferred candidates, say W and X, 100 to W, 100 to X, there's no way A can allocate A's votes that would prevent W and X from being in the top 5. So imagine W and X are B's preferred candidates. A will spread the 300 votes across 3 candidates to ensure that A elects 3 candidates to the board. And so the seats on the board will be allocated, not as we saw in straight voting, where they all went to A's favorite candidates, but they will be split in accordance, in a sense, with stock holdings. The advantage of cumulative voting for many is it preserves some hope for equity across stockholders in that outsiders can participate. They won't control the board here. B has only 2 out of the 5 seats, but at least they'll get some information, have some input. During the 19th century, the early 20th century, cumulative voting was the norm in the US. It's still a major feature in the California statute, but elsewhere, it's purely an elective feature. Another question is, which directors will we elect at any particular meeting? The default, what you might imagine, is that all seats on the board are up for election each year. That's often the way it happens, but not always. Take a look at section 141D of the Delaware Code. A corporation is entitled to break its board into 3 classes. Each year, only 1 class of seats will be up for election. It ends up being like the Senate. This means that each director has a 3-year term of office, not a 1-year term. So the turnover is only about 1/3 of the board each year. About 1/3 of public firms have staggered boards. During the 90s, it was more popular. About 60% of firms had them, but investors pushed back and many firms de-staggered their boards. This has relevance for removal, which we'll talk about next. The flip side of the power to vote in directors is the power to remove directors. You can think of these two powers as part of the same strategy of selecting the persons who will act on behalf of stockholders. Before the fact, stockholders can select a director. After the fact, directors can remove a director. Let's look at the removal statutes. Here's section 141K of the DGCL. Directors can be removed with or without cause. But let's take a look at subsection 1. If the board is classified, broken into classes as we just discussed under 141D, then a removal can only be for cause. The default is you can remove a director without cause. So what constitutes cause? Well, clearly fraud, if the director is engaged in fraud. But poor business judgment is almost certainly not cause. And you're guaranteed to have a fight about whether there's cause for removal, even if you can muster the majority of the shares to vote in favor. The RMBCA rule, which again Connecticut has adopted, is that shareholders can remove directors with or without cause, and it doesn't matter if the board is staggered or not. Okay, we're going to think about the mechanics of the proxy system, and specifically the question of reimbursement for proxy expenses. Section 212 of the DGCL sets up the proxy system. The basic idea is a simple one. You don't have to go to the meeting yourself to vote. Instead, you can send in a card with your vote and authorize someone else to cast that vote for you. That person acts as your proxy. We're going to see and hear this word proxy a lot. And so I want to spend a second talking about it and all the ways we're going to see it used. So the issue with the word proxy is it's going to have lots of similar confusing meanings. On the one hand, it means someone who's authorized to act for someone else. But a little confusingly, it also means the document that allows that person to act on the other person's behalf. So in a sense, you could say, here's my proxy to make somebody else my proxy. So because we're going to see this word thrown around a lot, I put together a little cheat sheet for you. So here are some of the most common ways we're going to see the word used with examples. We talked about the proxy as a person who acts on somebody else's behalf, but the proxy statement we're going to hear a lot about. That's the mailing the corporation sends to its stockholders, giving them all the information they need for the vote and telling them how the board thinks the stockholders ought to vote. The proxy card, or sometimes, like I said, just the proxy, is the document or instrument that appoints somebody else to act for you. When we get together, we will talk about what a proxy fight or a proxy contest is, and we'll also talk about the expenses associated with a proxy fight, called naturally proxy expenses, when we discuss the Rosenfeld case.